This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari. Now, as you might have noticed, the show is on pause waiting for season 2, but in the meanwhile, you can enjoy weekly highlights from the archives. Now, this first highlight revisits my discussion with neuroscientist and psychiatrist Gregory Berns. The original episode was number 4 and proved to be the second most popular episode in the history of the show. So here is one highlight from that conversation. In this section, we talk about mental health, about why it is so difficult to treat mental health problems and what we could perhaps do differently. I hope it provides you with some food for thought or even applicable tips for you or your loved ones. On that note, if you are interested in the technique that we discuss in the very end, please note that I actually mistakenly call it the internal family dynamics therapy. The correct name is internal family systems therapy, or IFST for short. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this little flashback. I bring to you, one more time, Gregory Berns.
So I was trained as a psychiatrist, and at least in the United States, where the DSM kind of rules the diagnosis of mental disorders, it's essentially a checklist type approach to diagnosis. By design, mental illness is a threshold. You either have enough of these symptoms where you cross the threshold and then you're diagnosed with a disorder, or you're below threshold. I think that's quite problematic, really, because over the years I've come to assume a continuum approach, to psychology and mental illness, that these disorders, even the most extreme like schizophrenia, are also on a continuum, that they represent one end of human experience, not categorically different, just more extreme.
I've heard some people who make the same argument say that historically, one of the reasons why we do conceptualize mental disorders in this very categorical way is there was a little bit of like medicine envy among psychiatrists, or maybe, to put it more charitably, a desire to be taken more seriously, for mental health to be taken as seriously as we take folks who study, whether you have polio or not, or whether you have COVID or not. There's a yes and no answer. So creating a rubric which would kind of mirror that medicinal categorical taxonomy of disease was, in a certain way, perhaps even necessary to get mental health to be recognized as an integral part of medicine. I don't know. Do you think that has some truth historically?
I do. I think there is medicine envy. I trained during the golden era of biological psychiatry. That's what drew me to it. So yes, I was seduced by the medicalization of psychiatry, and in the end, it was a false idol. It does not, in my experience, the biological treatments that we have for psychiatric illness are not nearly as effective as drug companies would have you believe.
Yes.
I remember when I was in training as a resident, and I would be in the emergency room, and I would see people come in for psychiatric reasons, and it always puzzled me. It's like, well, why is this person here? Is it because they have hallucinations? Is it because they're, screaming that the CIA has implanted them with something in their brains? It's like, no, that's not why they're there at that moment, because there are lots of people walking around with those beliefs. There's something else. There's something, kind of a failure of their social support system that has broken down, that caused them to be picked up by the police and brought to a psychiatric ER. So, yeah.
I guess the difficulty there is that even today, say with, I think a very easy way to conceptualize this question would be with depression. When somebody has major depressive disorder, do we say that it's just, well, we can all understand what it's like to be depressed? Well, they're really far on the continuum. And in a sense, I guess what you're saying is that is more accurate. But then again, it can also become a problem because of people around not taking the issue seriously enough. Like, oh, I know what it's like to be depressed. They're just a little bit depressed. And no, this requires a certain level of care that just being down for one day does not. And maybe our minds are just such that having this kind of neat buckets where you can put something in makes it easier to take seriously. I don't know. I don't know what your thoughts are.
It does. I mean, yeah. Who wouldn't like to take a pill and feel better, right? Humans have been doing that for millennia. It's human nature for, to alter our consciousness in ways that we think make us feel better. So yeah, it's very seductive to biologicalize mental health when you can only go so far with that. I think people realize that now. It's like, okay, how many antidepressants does a person have to take, and they don't get fully better? There's something else missing.
What is missing?
Well, I'm not a Freudian. I do not adhere to that framework of the psyche. But what is clear is that ultimately these breakdowns have to do with social connectedness. It's the isolation that these disorders cause that result kind of in the spiral down. And society has become such that we're not very good at addressing that anymore.
That's a hell of an answer.
I think in times past when society was much smaller and we lived in smaller groups, that we were a bit better at it. Because when humans lived in smaller communities, there was, you need to take care of your community in order for the community and the individuals within it to survive. And so you can't just hide the person who has odd beliefs. It's like, okay, well, you look out for each other a little bit. And my viewpoint on this has changed quite a bit in the last 2 years, since I moved out of the city, and now I live in the country, and I live in a very different community than I did 2 years ago. And I see the difference. Not necessarily better, but different.
Better in some regards, I'm sure. I think that would be one angle to explaining the almost like a weird paradox. I feel like if somebody asks, is the world going to a better or a worse direction when it comes to mental health? Well, it's obvious that it's going to better in the way that there's much more treatments available. We take it much more seriously, less stigmatization. On the other hand, there seems to be that numbers are not looking great when you just look at how much mood disorders, anxiety disorders there are, especially for the young. And I guess that would be one way to explain it, is that the sociologists and social scientists have been documenting this really dramatic, I don't want to sound too dramatic, but almost like a collapse of community, or at least decrease in community. I mean, the classic work on this would be Bowling Alone book, but there's plenty of work around how, wherever is it since the Second World War, since 60s, since 70s, 80s, wherever you pick the beginning, there's been this decline in communities.
Yeah.
And I guess if that is one of the root causes of mental health problems, maybe then that would explain this certain paradox.
Yeah.
Or at least part of it. I'm not saying it's the only explanation.
Right.
One of the things that I found important and almost liberating about this kind of thought experiment while reading your book, of taking it as seriously as I can, this idea of there not being a unified self, it happened to coincide with me talking to a friend who has been kind of experimenting on a kind of self-therapy technique that is similar to the internal family dynamics therapy. Are you familiar with that technique?
No.
It's quite fascinating. The basic idea is that it has nothing to do with family. Here's the first thing. So the idea is to conceptualize various parts of yourself as a person and seeing them almost as a family. And so the idea would be like, you're afraid of something, you can call this fear with a name, fear Fred or whatever. And then you visualize or imagine meeting this fear and asking, what is it that you really want? How can we help you? Bringing that kind of compassionate attitude that we have towards our friends towards these emotions. So not identifying with it, not being afraid, but having a discussion with this fear, taking it very seriously, but in this compassionate, friendly, kind way, instead of the much harsher way that we, I think, ironically often treat ourselves rather than our friends. But anyway, so I have a friend who's been experimenting on this kind of techniques, merging it with cognitive behavioral therapy and self-hypnosis. And we did some exercises with him, and it happened to coincide with me reading Self-Delusion. I saw a link in there, and it was quite fascinating. Just to notice how liberating it can be to take an emotion that seriously, but in that kind of friendly, arm's length way, and imagining this discussion with it.
It is very liberating. And, I take that very literally and talk a little bit about this towards the end of my book, that if you accept the idea that there's not a singular self, however you want to define it, that there are multiple yous, there are different ways to look at it. There's the past you, the present, and the future you as kind of different versions of self. There's also the different yous that you adopt in different social circumstances. So they're very different, and it's a matter of degree. Some people feel a slave to their past self in many ways. But, as I like to tell people, I say, well, look at a picture of yourself from 20 years ago. Is that the same person you are today? Physically, you're very different. On the outside, you're different. Certainly your brain has changed, especially if you go back to childhood. In my view, in no way, shape, or form are those the same people. So how much are you beholden to your past selves? And I think once you realize this, if you desire change, it can be very liberating to kind of free yourself from your past selves.
That was it for the first highlight of the season. If you liked it, you can revisit the first episode, that was number 4, or check the episode 9, which is a discussion that I had with Gregory Berns about animal neuroscience, focusing on his work with dogs. Anyway, I hope you have a great week, and I hope you tune in next time. Until then, take care.